World War II is often portrayed in the United States as having a clear moral superior and a moral inferior, the ultimate battle between good and evil. While it is true that the atrocities committed by the Axis powers were truly despicable, the true moral nature of the war is far more gray than the black and white war told in the United States. The ramping up of the use of area bombing during World War II contributed greatly to the astronomical increase in civilian deaths during the war. Analysis of Allied strategic bombing during World War II shows the triumph that the Allies enjoyed in the air came at the tragic cost of thousands of civilian lives on the ground. At the beginning of the Second World War, the U.S. Air Force focused on precision bombing strikes. These strikes were designed to destroy specific targets, such as an enemy factory or power station, while limiting civilian casualties. However, enemy air defenses on the ground and enemy fighters made low-altitude strikes far too perilous, forcing bombers to opt for high-altitude strikes. However, due to higher wind speeds, cloud cover, and poor targeting abilities, these strikes were often inaccurate, missing the target by miles. The British Royal Air Force had a far different strategic bombing policy. In 1942, Royal Air Force Air Chief Marshal Arthur T. Harris introduced area bombing to the Royal Air Force. In Harris's strategy, rather than placing the entire mission's success on a single bomb hitting a specific target, Harris advocated for dropping a large payload of bombs to burn down the entire industrial center. This strategy put civilians directly in harm's way and was one of the main factors contributing to the high death toll seen during World War II. The purpose of strategic bombing is to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war by knocking out three key pillars: infrastructure, economy, and industry. So, bombers traditionally target factories, roads, power stations, and large transit hubs. However, during World War II, a new target was added to the list: civilians. People are the foundation of a country's ability to fight a war. The civilian population arms, feeds, and clothes the nation's soldiers. While this tactic is rather sinister, it was embraced by much of the Allies' top brass. Commanding General of the U.S. Air Force, Henry Arnold, was quoted as saying it made a lot of sense to kill skilled workers. And according to James Coram, an American air power historian, the Royal Air Force emphasized breaking enemy morale by bombing its cities. Both sides of the war practiced this type of bombing. At the beginning of the war in Europe, the German Luftwaffe launched a series of strikes against the Allied nations called the terror bombings. Both sides understood the deep psychological effects that these bombings had on the population, thus spawning a wave of propaganda to keep morale high during these bombings. The most famous of these being the British Keep Calm and Carry On campaign during the Battle of Britain. An estimated 60,000 British civilians were killed during the Battle of Britain, and many others lost their homes, but the British people endured. While it is true that both the Allies and the Axis bombed urban centers, the Allies' bombings were far more extensive. Aerial warfare became far more prominent in the British and the American air forces as technology progressed rapidly since World War I. In the lead up to World War II, optics, radar, and plane technology advanced greatly, making air warfare far more effective and reliable. Mass production techniques derived from industrialization, coupled with improved technology, allowed the British and the Americans to produce a large amount of long-range heavy bombers capable of delivering large payloads from airfields in England all the way to Berlin. Larger fuel capacities and improved engines of heavy bombers enabled bomber aircraft to fly higher and farther than before. Flying at high altitude kept Allied bombers out of range of German and Japanese anti-air guns and above the service ceilings of the German Bf-109 and Japanese A-6M fighters. At the beginning of the war, the Royal Air Force's bombing strategy was to provide an escort of fighters to push back defending fighters. Later in the war, however, the German Luftwaffe used fighter sweeps, in which fast and deadly Stuka dive bombers attacked distant Allied airfields before the defending fighters could get off the ground. Later, the Royal Air Force ditched their fighter escorts and started performing nighttime bombings, in which they relied on radar to hit their targets. The radar was very rudimentary, and was only able to identify general locations, such as cities, thus relegating these night raids to area bombing strikes only. These night raids were extremely effective thanks to these basic radar units, and it was this secret that the Royal Air Force tried to hide by saying their pilots ate carrots to improve their eyesight. The United States also abandoned the escort fighter strategy in favor of relying on their bombers' onboard armaments to defend themselves. American B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers began to fly in a combat box formation. These box formations were made up of 18 to 54 heavy bombers, each armed with Browning machine guns designed to fight off enemy fighters. In the box formation, the bombers were oriented such that they were able to cover each other from all angles. This strategy was extremely effective and was used until the end of the war. The most decisive bombing campaigns in the Pacific War were not the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The most destructive air raid of all time was conducted by the U.S. Air Force on the night of March 9, 1945, over Tokyo. This attack was known as Operation Meeting House. 279 B-29 Superfortresses, fully loaded with thousands of pounds of incendiary bombs, flew tight and low over eastern Tokyo. The U.S. Air Force sought to exploit the high density and flammability of Tokyo's urban sprawl with incendiary bombs, and it worked. Eastern Tokyo burned throughout the night. According to Thomas Searle, nearly 90,000 civilians were killed, another 41,000 were injured, and over 1 million were left homeless. Raids similar to Operation Meeting House have been carried out since June 1944. Bombers loaded with incendiary bombs, launched from Guam and Tinian, turned Japan's industrial centers into infernos that left the nation burning until the end of the war in August of 1945. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, an estimated 321 million pounds of bombs were dropped on the Japanese home islands throughout the campaign, killing over 300,000 civilians and wounding another 500,000. One of the most controversial Allied actions of the war was the bombing raids on the German city of Dresden in February 1945. On the night of February 13th, the Royal Air Force launched an 800-bomber raid on the city, with 2,700 tons of bombs dropped, the majority of it being incendiary bombs. The next day, the U.S. Air Force sent in another 210 bombers, dropping another 400 tons of bombs. The incendiary bombs created a firestorm, which burned much of the city, resulting in an immense amount of casualties, ranging from some 25,000 to 35,000 civilians dead in Dresden in the air attacks, though some estimates are as high as 250,000, given the influx of undocumented refugees that had fled to Dresden from the Eastern Front. The brutality of the bombing was a product of the Allies' total war strategy, which they adopted as part of their final assault into the German homeland. The destruction seen in Dresden would soon engulf Nazi Germany as Allied bombers rained terror onto Germany's cities. While it is hard to deny the technological and military triumph that the Allies accomplished during World War II with strategic bombings, it is equally difficult to recognize the ethical and human tragedy that these bombing campaigns presented. The common justification for the Allied bombing campaigns is that these bombing raids actually saved millions of lives by preventing a long, drawn-out conventional invasion of the Japanese and German homelands. However, many argue that the civilian costs cannot be justified, and a conventional invasion may have at least given the civilian population time to flee before the fighting. Today, the United States still grapples with the issue of civilian casualties. Drone strikes have grown in prominence in the U.S.'s decades-long war on terror. Critics of drones say that using drones disconnects the pilot from the mission, thus opening up room for a lack of proper discretion with regards to limiting civilian casualties. However, supporters of the use of drones say that it keeps American lives out of harm's way and is far more cost-effective than launching fighters. Strategic bombing during World War II is often hailed as one of the greatest triumphs of Allied war effort. The bombings were massively successful in crippling the Axis' ability to fight the war, and the success of these bombings solidified the importance of air warfare in military doctrine going forward. The immense amount of money that the world's most powerful military spent on their air force can be attributed to the new balance of military power established during World War II. However, despite the success, the tragic loss of civilian life during these bombing campaigns raises an important moral question that our society has to confront how we wage war.